Gracias, Luis. Gracias, Maria. Okay. I always get a little bit nervous for the first 5 minutes of a presentation, but then I find my rhythm, so just give me a second, it's okay. First of all, I'd like to thank everyone here at Central Multimedia for having me this week. Working with the participants of LEVA and thinking through different aspects of video game design and how this might constitute a methodology of approaching game design criticism and scholarly investigation. Now my work here has been focused on design. Design is really kind of only a tangential relationship to my scholarly work. However, for the past 10 years or so, I've dedicated much of my time working as a curator, one with a specialty in video games. As a result, I've not only become a student of design, I've become increasingly interested in video games, both as an artistic medium and as historical artifacts. This also led me to start thinking about how we deal with both of these questions and conditions, whether through critical or vernacular discourses. So my dissertation work right now is focused on the role of museums, art galleries, and alternative spaces in both creating and disseminating discourse. Not only about the formal or aesthetic, we can call these artistic facets of video games, but also how they regard games as historical objects, what sort of modes of interpretation are taking place, and how these objects and their interpretation in these contexts, is that me that's popping? I'm just going to slide that down. There we go. That should be better. And also how their interpretation in these contexts are presented to the public through exhibitions, events, and other kinds of display methods. Obviously, museums have multiple mandates, but heritage and history are generally two of the key issues that museums are trying to convey. Representation of historical context for objects and artifacts, and the archiving, preservation, and conservation of these artifacts. I have a personal passion for the history of media in general, from broadcast, so radio and television, to the computational, as of course does the Academy. Within the Academy there are a myriad of modes and methods that work to examine these artifacts, their social and cultural impacts, etc. So it's no wonder then, with the rise of game studies, that many of these same modes and methods are also being applied to the medium. If we consider this alongside the ubiquity of video games in general, and look both within and without the Academy, we can see myriad examples which explore, investigate, and unearth the history of the medium. And I'm deeply interested in the ways in which this idea of history is articulated in sort of all of its modes. All right. So let's look at a few ways we can think about the problem of the history of video games. And I say problem specifically because I think this will become clear as to why over this talk. The question of history can often be messy. It's full of conflicting discourses and moments of peculiar tensions. And I think the concept of the branching narrative here, seen here mapped out, becomes a really excellent way for us to make sense of the various ways in which video game history is approached. So if we regard each of the perspectives I'm going to talk about today as sort of unique discursive formations in the sort of Foucauldian archaeological sense, then they become constellations of historical attitudes, ideological inclinations, and cultural and social formations. This then makes the project of medium-specific history seem a bit more complicated at first. But what it does is it also allows to give us a bit more nuance in the way that we look at history, giving agencies to those interested in such things to dig deeper into specific situations and moments while connecting it to the larger networks and narratives of the medium's history. For the remainder of the talk, what I'm going to do is I'm going to break down some of these more dominant forms of doing video game history, as well as talking about more emergent modes, which we're working towards in a sort of holistic critical perspective, I guess is a good way to put this, which enables scholars, researchers, and enthusiasts outside of the Academy to kind of all work toward adding nodes to this narrative network. All right, so we can ask ourselves before moving on, what do we know about video game history, and how was it that that knowledge has been produced and disseminated? Where did we get that information, and how can we chart its epistemological histories? What are the stories that we all know, and how did we come to know them? And I think this is a really important question to reflect on. More importantly, I think we can ask ourselves, where do the gaps emerge in our collective knowledge, and how was it that we consider what we consider to be a more mainstream historical narrative in relation to games increase those gaps, and why do those gaps exist? Who's doing work to address these questions, and what is the implication of this kind of work? Ultimately, these are the questions that drive me when I think about how we interpret video game histories, or how we represent video game histories, and how we interpret, share, and propagate them. And I start here perhaps because within this particular mode of history, we see the most often repeated narratives, the most attention, both scholarly and popular, focuses itself here. And it's an easy way to discuss the origins of the medium. And I also think it's worth mentioning here, specifically being in Mexico City, that these discussions are generally centered on North America, Japan, and Europe, rather than other parts of the world that have sort of made their own contributions to history as well. But I want you all to think about something for a second. Just a second. Every time any one of us says video game history rather than the medium of video games, we're making a very specific ideological gesture, and one that I think is worth thinking about. It's like talking about the film industry instead of talking about the medium of film. It privileges a particular mode of production, a particular set of aesthetics and forms, and rather than discussing the sort of the myriad of possibilities that the medium can contain. So some of the other modes of history that I'm going to discuss can be considered to be operating sort of under the larger umbrella of the concept of industrial histories. For example, design histories, hardware histories, development histories, etc. And I'll touch on each of those in a few minutes, but first let's talk about the idea of capital I industrial history and its relationship to video games. And there's a great deal of information within what we consider to be the industrial history of video games. It's the grand central narrative that everything else branches off from. It's the first instance of the medium's history that we see discussed, and often, I would argue, is a narrative that gets repeated as much inside of academic discourse as it does within popular discourses. In fact, there was a period of time, which was not that long ago, which often saw academic text, events, and presentations often sort of prefaced with a sort of packaged language discussing video games as a multi-billion-dollar global industry, and that was sort of the primary justification for engaging in any sort of scholarly investigation related to games. This wasn't always the case, but most historical work, academic or otherwise, sort of begins in that moment. Okay, so generally when we discuss industrial histories of video games, they often look something like this. And I just pulled this from the internet, and there's many, many examples of this. But it's a very linear timeline, which moves from video games' earliest moments. So this one actually starts with jukeboxes and foosball machines, up till contemporary sort of examples of the technology. And part of the underlying argument that I'm trying to get to here is there is a very deterministic quality to doing this kind of history. Each time a new piece of video game technology emerges on the market, it's always regarded as being somehow superior to the thing that came before it. And it often uses language that is largely fetishistic, discussing the performance capabilities of each new piece of hardware. And each new development and the increase of storage and processing capacity also leads us down this path where discussions of the new and increasingly uncanny forms of representational imagery emerge, each time sort of eschewing whatever was great about the last development in favor of the new. In Best Before, Video Games, Obsolescence, and Supersession, which is a book I actually recommend that everybody interested in game history look at, James Newman critiques this dominant mode of doing history by highlighting how this industrial history creates this grand narrative of both innovation and supersession. And it's also worth noting that much of these discourses in this regard treat the creators of innovative games and technologies as great men of industry.
En el libro de James Newman, Invest Before Video Games, Obsolescence and Suppression, aquí nos muestra la historia de la innovación y de la supresión. También habla de la creación y de la innovación de los videojuegos, así como de la tecnología que han hecho los grandes hombres de la industria.
So this great men of industry problem treats game designers in the same way that we might regard someone like Thomas Edison or other early inventors in the turn of the 19th and 20th century. It ends up being a very early modernist perspective, and one that doesn't really account for the myriad of actors within the video game industry. And one of the ways we might consider how this came to be is from a more political economic examination of the video games industrial history. A really good example of this would be like the book Digital Play, which was written by Stephen Klein, Greg DePuter, and Nick Dyer-Witherford. And in this book, rather than repeating the same narratives that I've mentioned, narratives that ultimately are actually deeply rooted in the marketing language of game companies when they're releasing new hardware and software, the authors sort of take this moment as their starting point and unpack the political economic dimensions of the marketing strategies of companies like Nintendo and Sega in the 80s and 90s. And they use this as a way to discuss how these companies weren't just interested in locking down production and distribution of their products, but they also worked very hard to control how and where their products were consumed. For a really good example of this, Nintendo had this really strict licensing strata, which limited how many games any third-party developer could make in any given year, and as well as having final approval over those games using something called the Nintendo Code. And the Nintendo Code was a moralistic model, much like the Hays Code of Hollywood in the 1930s, which meant that video games could not feature graphic violence, blood, nudity, drug use, or explicit or implicit sexual imagery. And increasingly we're seeing more of the kind of work that the authors in that book did in relation to industrial history with video games. And that highlights and investigates these ideological conditions of the business of games. And it's worth noting here that Nintendo's model is actually one which they still use today, and it's actually one that most other video game companies have adopted as well. Just as a way to highlight how companies like Nintendo have tried to control the production and their consumption of their IPs, we can see how the company itself has done a great deal of work to historicize its own mascots. And this is the kind of practice we can see the video game companies often do. It kind of works as a marketing strategy. So on the one hand, they always have fans looking forward to consume new iterations of their IPs, but they also have them perpetually looking backwards through the lens of nostalgia marketing in order to promote consumption of retro imagery in games at the same time. And we can see this, again, I feel like I'm being really hard on Nintendo right now, and I don't mean to be, but we can see this through something as well like the Virtual Console. So the Virtual Console is Nintendo's own proprietary emulation system, which resells digital packaged versions of games from old consoles, the Nintendo, the Super Nintendo, and the Game Boy, constantly sort of repacking and reselling their own history as a sort of commodified and corporate partisan articulation of archival practice and heritage. All right, so before I move on from my final sort of discussion of the industry, I feel like it's worth mentioning that the grand narrative of the video game industry also produces a series of often repeated myths about itself, and myths which sort of perpetually get repeated by fans, press, the academy, and the industry itself. Perhaps the most notable example of something like this that I'm talking about could be what is generally referred to as the Great Video Game Crash of 1983. In and of itself, actually, which has produced an entirely new subset of myths as well. So the story goes like this. It was a time when everyone was trying to get into the video game business, and the market had become so saturated with hardware and third-party crapware games that game consumers lost confidence and stopped buying new hardware and games. This is E.T. Full disclosure, I always talk about E.T. Because I love this game. But from an academic distance from this history, I have to say that this is actually probably one of the most mythologized games in video game history. It was most notably called the worst game ever made, and it even became the scapegoat for the entire crash of the industry. So stories began circulating. The reason that poor little E.T. Caused the industry to crash was that Atari made too many of the games, over anticipating its sales, or that so many people actually returned the game because they hated it so much that it caused everything to just collapse. Which I think we can all agree is pretty ridiculous. But the mythology that emerges here is, I think, like super interesting. And it's one that gets repeated over and over and over again. And even now, I've encountered people who are several generations past the release of this game, who still mythologize it and call it the worst game. And they've probably never even played it. So I find that very interesting. Okay, so what happens from here is that the story evolves. And it evolves to tell how Atari had so many E.T. cartridges that they had no choice but to take them all and bury them in a landfill in New Mexico. Just E.T. cartridges. This is the story, just to be clear. The myth is about so many E.T. cartridges. But this is interesting. So if you do a little digging, you can actually find scans of the, sorry, I'm totally going off script for a second. You can find scans of the Alamogordo Daily News' article about the Atari dump. And what they did actually bury was cartridges in the desert, but they actually unloaded a warehouse that came from Texas full of products. And this included not just E.T., but other games, hardware, and unreleased prototypes. And then they bulldozed them before they buried them. So the myth, while based in fact, has sort of like been distorted a little bit over time as well. So we'll take it from mythology being distorted, and then we'll move to this. And the mythology has carried on so much over time that just last year, the most recent development is this documentary called Game Over, Atari Game Over. And you can tell clearly that they still think E.T. is to blame for this, which re-mythologizes the whole thing without really being all that historically accurate, except for the location. I think the lesson here is that popular historical discourses can be very tricky business, and they succumb to all kinds of distortion over time. And one of those distortions, particularly in the case of this film, is marketing. Because if you see, these are actually promotional images that they used to promote the film with them holding E.T. cartridges that they found, but in the film they actually show like all the other stuff they found as well. So it's like an interesting kind of way in which to propagate the myth in order to get people to watch the movie. So I'm going to move on from the industrial history now, and we're going to talk a little bit about one of the more emergent phenomena that we're seeing in fan culture right now. And this is how fans are beginning to engage with video game history. And there are whole communities of fans who are now blogging, writing, and publishing their own interpretations of the history. This is my friend Metal Jesus. But he's a member of video game collectors who are constantly making videos about collecting and archiving in games, and they're also engaging in this interesting sort of like unpacking of different histories right now. And I think while these videos are interesting, they're not without their problems. If we look at any number of videos by these creators, but if we look at any of these videos by these creators, there's actually this great deal of conceptual overlap that's sort of occurring. So on the one hand, while museums and galleries and archival institutions are actually grappling with real technological and legal issues around the preservation of games, these YouTube collectors are simply solving the problem by amassing colossal collections in their basements, garages, and spare bedrooms. However, the building of these private collections of hardware, software, and paratext, I would argue, are driven by consumer desires rather than sort of actual desires of heritage. So it's also worth noting here that while we find there's a particular kind of canonization that starts happening in collectors, and it's one that actually echoes the canon of fiscal success that we see in the video game industry. So in the industry, games are generally canonized because of how many units they sold. And it starts sort of getting echoed through fan culture at this point as well. Generally the construction of a fan canon, both through these videos and popular gaming press, emerged through the creation of best of or worst of lists. And often these canons line up quite well with those industrial histories that I was just mentioning, and we generally end up seeing the same titles privileged in both of those contexts. So we end up with things like top 20, or top 10, top 20, top 50, top 100, and yes, there is a top 1,000 video games. All right, so, and now we're gonna take another sort of step here to another mode of historical examination that's recent-ish, and this would be what we can think through as design history. So in design history, what we can do is we can deploy more formal explorations of games historically, and sometimes this allows us to sort of untangle them from their commercial contexts and explore how different design strategies and techniques emerge throughout the history of the medium. So by using a medium-specific formal approach, we can look at singular works or sort of constellations of examples and uncover, or constellations of examples such as mechanics, architectures, and world building. And once we're able to uncover formal similarities between games over time. So what this does is this allows us to sort of uncouple ourselves from linear chronological trajectories of historical examination, and we can start moving elliptically, noting how different design strategies or movement can connect historical works with contemporary work, which is a great time for me to revisit the question of ET. This was actually the whole reason for the lecture, honestly. And it's to discuss something like how, in spite of popular opinion, ET used a number of design strategies that actually make it a very interesting, innovative, and formal work sort of in the larger history of video games. What ET did was it used this thing, it used what was called a zoning system. I'm going to get up close here so I can show you. So it was a system of zones wherein, depending on where ET was on the screen, this icon would change, and it would actually change the function of the button on the joystick. And what this did was this allowed a whole bunch of different set of actions, which is remarkable given that the joystick only had one button. So Howard Scott Warshaw, the designer of the game, found a way to map and squeeze all of this function into a single button by manipulating the actual space of the game, which I think is like very, very interesting. And there's one more way we can look at this, I think that's really interesting. At a time when games were about conflict and combat, E.T. was ultimately a game about running away. Running away from the scientists or the FBI and never actually entering into combat with them at all. And if we stop and think about this for a minute, we can actually see E.T. as a sort of a proto-endless runner, which is a genre such as Cannibalt or any other runner game, which is a genre that like totally proliferates through like contemporary game space. Okay, one more example here in design history. So I've done a great deal of work on something called the ZX Spectrum, which was a British microcomputer in the 1980s. It was a small, affordable computer, and what it did is it enabled this incredibly rich hobbyist game development scene that was made up predominantly of working class people in Britain at the time. These works created in this scene embodied the working class preoccupations of their creators. Seeing games made about delivery truck drivers, trashmen, and miners. And the mining games are of particular interest, I think, because they were actually made around the same time as the Great Miners' Strike in the UK in the 1980s, and they explicitly connected the working class politics of the miners to their games. So here, if we think through this in terms of a design history and try to make some connections to these blue-collar games to more contemporary examples, I think what we end up seeing is we end up seeing a very clear connection with serious games, which I think is of particular interest to most of the participants in LEVA this year, because most of them are making serious games. So almost 30 years before we have a term called serious games, we have games that were being made with embedded political messages, which had already become sort of integrating and thinking through games as digital pedagogical tools, which I think is like super cool, for lack of a better word. So I'm kind of going through these sort of slices and sections. So I want to talk a little bit about what we could constitute as an art history of games. And there are several ways which we can approach this problem. So generally, this is regarded as a sort of medium-oriented way in which to look at works which somehow achieve the status of art within the medium. So if we look at this through discussions of other forms of mass art, that we can see when we see that games are made under these sort of industrial mass entertainment contexts that fall under this rubric, there's some kind of esoteric quality in an object of mass art that when we call it art, it means that it's entertainment, but it's got something else, some kind of esoteric quality that suddenly like elevates it to the level of art. Right. So so they're entertainment, but they're art. And generally speaking, these kinds of discourses generally emerge through modes of popular criticism and fan culture, rather than say actual sort of art discourses. So while this, I think, is a useful way to think about more sort of critically acclaimed works within the larger popular game cultures, for example, everybody calls BioShock art, even though it's a shooter, but it's art, but it's a shooter. Anyway, I'm particularly interested in other forms of art history in relation to games. So this articulates itself for me in two different historical and contemporary phenomena. One is called game art, and the other is called art games. So game art is generally regarded as a movement that when new media artists began to engage with the medium of video games in their own practices. So this starts in the mid to late 1990s, and it was predominantly new media and net artists who were modifying video games, exploring the spatial and material conditions of the first-person shooter. So this includes works like Sod by Yodi, which was actually here at CenArt in September, October last year at Transidio. That's the one on the left. That's a mod of Castle Wolfenstein, for anybody who wanted to know. And what they did is they sort of deconstructed the space, reduced the playability of it, and created this sort of like formal geometric exploration of game space. And we can also see this in the ROM hacking work of Cory Arcangel in Super Mario Clouds, which is languidly drifting behind me. So what Cory Arcangel did, he took away all of the elements of the game except for the sky and the clouds, and then all they do is move on their own. So essentially he took what was a playable game and rendered it into a looping video format that's meant to be sort of quiet and meditative. So there are a myriad of other examples in game art, and I was going to show you some, but as I just mentioned, I forgot to put the slide in my presentation. But game art is sort of the closest thing that we can see where the relationships between games and new media art, sort of the closest games have ever come to approaching the art world, like the art world, global sort of art world. It's very well documented as well. These works have been shown in museums and galleries around the world for the last 20 odd years. So it's a very sort of important sort of historical and contemporary practice within sort of new media art and games. So next is art games. So this kind of art games kind of emerge as sort of a subcategory of indie games, but it's a subcategory that was created by the makers of the games themselves, rather than like say critics, who usually are people who sort of comment on movements and name them. So this was a group of indie game developers who sort of collectively began declaring that their works were art. And this kind of history is still being written, obviously, but it often follows a bit of a modernist trajectory in the same way that I was talking about the modernist trajectory of discourses of invention. So in this, it's sort of the modernist discourse of the artist as lone genius. And we can see this in the way that both mostly through how the popular press has treated luminary figures in art games such as Jason Rower or Jonathan Blow. So that's Jason Rower's Passage, and that's Jonathan Blow's new game, The Witness. So historically, we consider these to be contemporary offshoots of indie games. But what's really interesting about indie games at large right now is how the community, whoops, I'll get to that in a second, is how the community is sort of splitting and resplitting and splintering right now. So what's emerging in indie games, we sort of see the indie game / art game thing emerge, and now we start seeing people calling themselves DIY game makers, and now we have this thing also called the alt game scene, which is also very different. And one of the things I think is really interesting about this is while it's being generally regarded as a contemporary phenomenon, these scenes actually have a remarkably enough, they have a great deal in common with sort of the passions and political dimensions of these ZX Spectrum makers that I mentioned. All right, so maybe you've seen by now that the thing about writing history is that we know the project will never be complete, because I'm always talking about sort of historical and contemporary phenomenon. So any history, examining a medium or otherwise, will always be subjected to new interpretations, new ideological examinations, be uncovering new context and contemporary relationships. So we can see this through the works that I mentioned in relation to industrial history, and we can see this in the way that many are thinking through design histories, and even fan histories. And there's, including an upcoming book by Melanie Swalwell. So I'm plugging this book for a reason, because I have a chapter in it, by the way. But this book actually sees not only examinations of how fans do history, but also how we can frame fan production, such as modding, bootlegging, etc., is actually being integral to the part of the larger story of video games. So in terms of queer work and its relation to the alt game movement that I mentioned, game makers and critics such as Robert Yang are working towards examining games in queer context, and if you're interested, I highly recommend looking up his work. It's actually very, very interesting. Now I'm going to just look specifically at the feminist context. We can see the video work of Anita Sarkeesian, who's fairly well known, working to expose the sort of the male-dominant mode of games as a way to enter not into simply a historical dialogue with sort of male-centric practices in games, but also very much a contemporary one. Also, we have the work of artists and scholar critics like Rachel Whale, whose work with the Femicom Museum, which is the logo on the right. The Femicom Museum is a feminine computer museum, and what she's doing is she's working to reclaim the usually dismissed sort of pink-washed in technologies of games marketed specifically towards girls throughout the history, as a larger project of sort of digging through feminist and post-feminist histories in games. What's worth noting with her work is that these games are no longer these sort of regarded as these throwaway objects from the larger marketed for girls phenomenon of the industry, but Rachel reclaims them as critical works within the medium's history. And we can also see this kind of independent critical work being done by fans, critics, and enthusiasts. It's with basically getting into zine publishing, specifically about video game history, specifically about alternative and gendered and feminist histories, such as Memory Insufficiency by Zoya Street, or the Memory Card Zine by Isabel Harap, It's very interesting that we're talking about history and the word memory keeps reemerging here through these projects. And these actually are zines which ask for people to contribute writing to the ongoing examination of video games through both feminine and feminist lenses. Okay, so we're almost there. So lastly, I want to address something very quickly, which we might call secret histories. Perhaps we would call them pirate histories. And I want to address this because this is actually a sort of singular preoccupation of mine right now, and it's actually becoming a pretty integral part of my PhD research. And that's the question of bootlegged or pirated games and their place in the larger history of the medium. So actually, while fan culture actually is very good at doing work to uncover these histories, these works, whether created and distributed through the black market or what we could consider to be a pirate commons, which is a place where fans distribute pirated material freely to one another, this is a field, I think, where a great deal of work needs to be done. If you ask why, well, I think that generally this work is regarded as unsanctioned or unwanted, and piracy is generally framed as being morally aberrant, specifically by the industry, which is interesting because exhibitions which deal with the history of video games just omit this phenomenon entirely, which is why I'm so interested in it. But within these cultures, there are these very, for me, very fascinating communities of practitioners who are hacking, modifying, and remixing game culture, and they're sort of taking this global phenomenon and they're re-articulating it in local contexts. Mexico City, talk about being here. As I discovered when I visited for a Transvideo last year, and even more so for this trip, is a site rich with these cultures. As you can see, all of these pictures were actually taken this week. So I spent some time at the undergrounds, plazas and arcades this week. And what I'm really interested in, and this is actually, I'll be coming back next year to do some of this this work with the Museo del Juguete Antiguo. Is that right? Sorry, my accent is terrible. But I'll be working on a project with the Antique Toy Museum. I'll just say it like that because it's easier for me. Connecting sort of these practices with arcade objects, but also like connecting them to the larger history of the medium and actually doing some like real historical work here. Instead of leaving them where they're generally regarded as these sort of phantoms that kind of linger at the margins of video game history. Last slide, we made it. I've kind of taken you through a great deal of information, obviously. I've cut across a wide array of perspectives, but you should also know that even in order to keep this at the time that it was, there were already a great deal of number of things that I wanted to include that I had to leave out. So what I hope that I've accomplished here is that I hope that I've been able to show you that each of these perspectives that I've kind of gone through have advantages and disadvantages, and that each very clearly sort of privilege a particular politic, practice, or ideology. And just in closing, I think what I'm always most interested in is works that actually work to disrupt this sort of conventional notion of canonization in history, whether that's the sort of museum stuff that's the topic of my dissertation, or the way in which history is represented in sort of academic or written texts. And what I'm interested in is looking for work which uncovers these lesser represented works, these underrepresented makers and communities, and uncovers the secret, the strange, the wonderful, and the yet to be discovered. Gracias.